Hi there, welcome back to this part 2 of our Introduction to View Models and Validation in ASP.NET MVC. In this lesson, we're going to dig a little deeper into understanding what view models are and how they're useful, and in particular, how they let us add complexity to our views previously not available to us. So the use case here that we want to explore is, so far our cheese application only stores a name and a description. So we might want to be able to store additional information about the cheeses that we're creating in our app. In particular, it would be nice to be able to have sort of some categories for different types of cheeses, right? So that's what we want to look at adding to our application right now. So if you go to the cheese class, this is our model. You might think that one way to do that would be to say add a new property that was a string that was called a type. And this would give our cheese, each cheese, its own type stored as a string. However, this is not a great way to store this type of data. So in particular, if you think of the different types of cheeses you might have some hard cheeses, you might have soft cheeses, you might have moldy cheeses. I don't know, you might have different types of cheese, but the whole point is you're going to have a specific, it's most likely the case that you have a specific finite set of different categories that you would want to enable users to use within your application, and just making it a string value would let them type in whatever they wanted, and that's, at the end of the day, it's going to be not that useful to have a string field for something like this that's a more categorical type of data. Okay, so so one way to think about this is to think about adding a new class that represents the type of cheese. Rather than using a string, let's add a new model class that represents the type of cheese. So I'm going to add a new class to my models folder. I'm going to call it cheese type. Okay, now what purpose should this fulfill? That's the question we have. If we want to have a finite set of cheeses or types of cheeses that our users can enter, one thing we might think about is to say that this could be just a bunch of constants. We could make a public const string and call this hard, and that could be just equal to a hard type, public const string soft. Okay, so we could do some things like this. However, there's actually a special type of class construct specifically made to hold these types of things, and that's called an enum. So I want to introduce enums to you a little bit. There's also going to be some reading you've already been given just prior to this video to look at what enums are. And enums are fairly simple to understand and start using, even if kind of the way they're constructed within C# might be a little bit more complex. We'll be able to get up and running with them pretty quickly. So the way we can make an enum is to, rather than just creating a regular class, I'm going to go ahead and delete these constants, I can create an enum. An enum is just basically an abbreviation for an enumeration. An enumeration represents a class that can have a specific finite set of values. And all I have to do, the minimum amount of work I have to do to create an enum type is just within it, is just specify the specific values that it can have. So I'm going to say that my cheese types are hard, soft, and fake cheese like Velveeta or Cheese Whiz. So these are the three values that the cheese type can have, and I just can put them right in there, separated by a comma. That's all I need to do. That's the simplest enum you can do. So notice that when I hover over these, I get these little pop-ups that say that these values are equal to integers. And that's because these enum values are backed up by integers. When you actually look at them, the way they're internally represented within C# within your computer is going to be as integers. And essentially these are going to be named constant integers that correspond to the specific types that you've defined here in your enum. Okay, so again, we're not going to go too far or too deep with enums, but they're pretty useful. And this is exactly the use case that they're made for, which is to use it for categorical types of data that are fixed, that are constant. So let's go back to our cheese class and use the cheese types there instead of a string. So I'm just going to change the name of my type property to be cheese type. Okay, so now my cheese is capable of holding different types that are defined by this enum. This property can be one of 3 values, which are defined here. It can be either hard, soft, or fake. If I wanted to actually say initialize this one and provide a default type, I could say something like type equals cheese type dot hard. So this will just put the hard value inside of the type property. We're not actually going to do that though. I just wanted to show you the syntax to use if you did want to do that. What we want to do is we want the user to be able to select the type of cheese as they're creating it from a drop-down in the form. Okay, and this is going to be some work we're going to do between the view model, and the controller. So let's go to our view model. So here we said previously that our view model was set up to represent the data associated with the add cheese view, the form, and the form processing. And so far we've only had 2 pieces of data that have been associated with that. Here we're going to actually add 2 more. Even though we're only adding one thing, which is a cheese type, we're going to add 2 more items to our view model. The first thing we want to add is a property just to represent the cheese type that the user is going to set when they create one via the form. Actually, let me do this. I'm going to do this with the shortcut here. Prop tab tab. Okay, and then you're going to have to add that using statement. All right, and so now we have a property here to represent the cheese type that we want to make available as an option for the user to submit. However, there's the other side of this. This is going to represent the cheese type that the user has selected. If we think about how we're rendering our forms in the template, we're rendering our forms using data and properties from the view model, right? So here, if we only have a place to store one specific type, this is meant to store the type of cheese that the user has selected. If I want to render a form that gives the user all of the options to choose from using a select element, I need to actually have additional data within my view model to make that available. And so here's how we do that. Let's make another property. And this is going to be a list, and it's going to have a special type in it called select list items, and this is going to be called cheese types. And again, you'll have to add a using statement. And for select list item, it's part of Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC rendering. It's part of that namespace. Okay, so this this collection of things will represent the choices the user has to create the cheeses. And I'm going to have to do some initialization to this list, right? So far, this list doesn't have anything to do with the different cheese types. It's just declared to be a list of select list items. I need to create select list items that will represent the different cheese types. So I'm going to do that. There are some different ways you can do this, but I'm going to do it in a constructor for my class. The first thing I'm going to do is just initialize. Oops. So we need to populate this list with the different options that the user should be presented with in the form. Right now, this list hasn't even been initialized. There's nothing here, and in particular, there's nothing that's tying these select list items to the specific cheese type values. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to do this in a constructor. Okay, and so the first thing I need to do is to just initialize this to be an empty list. Oops. There we go. Feeling a little clumsy today. So we just want to make a new empty list of select list items. And then I want to add a bunch of select list items to represent the cheese types. In particular, I'm going to add 3 of them. So I can say cheese types dot add. And then within that, I want to create a new select list item. And again, envision these as being drop elements in a drop down that the user will be presented with, or representing the data for those things. So every select list item has 2 properties that determine how ASP.NET should render that select list in the view. There's a value property. We'll fill that in a second. And there's a text property. And so if we think of, say, what an option element, so if we think of what our select list is going to look like, it's going to have a bunch of options in it. And the way we write the HTML for that is to say that the option has a value equal to something, and then it has a name, right? Since our enum types, each of the values of our enum type are represented by integers, we're going to go ahead and use that integer as the value of our of each of the options. So this is the HTML that we want to be generated by this select list item when we go to render it in the view. And so the value should correspond to the integer here that backs up that enum, and the text should correspond to the text that's there. So the way we can get this is as follows. The text is pretty easy. I can say cheese type dot hard dot toString. Okay, and that will give me just the string hard. And then for the value, I can say something similar, but first I want the integer value of it. So I can cast the cheese type dot hard to an integer. All right, but value has to be a string, so then I need to call the toString method on that integer. When we cast an enum to an integer using this syntax, it gives us the integer that represents that enum. In this case, as we see from the little pop-up there, that will be 0, since 0 is the integer backing up the hard value. Okay, so this will create a new select list item and add it to my cheese types list. And then I can just do this for the others as well. And I'm just going to do this kind of in a quick and dirty way. You can loop through a set of enums. I'll leave that as a homework exercise for you to go search on the internet and see how you might do that. Obviously, if you had more than 3, this would get pretty tedious pretty quick. But the point is here not to become experts at working with enums, but to become fluent at ViewModels. So I'm going to do this in a quick and dirty way for this lesson. So now every time I create a new add cheese view model in my controller, it will get a list of cheese types. There will be 3 things in that list, and each one will correspond to a different enum value of my cheese type class, my cheese type enum class. And then finally, when the user submits that list, that type will then be represented by this separate property of my add cheese view model. So in this case, because we want to present the user with options, we need 2 different members of our class to actually make up this one particular property. We need one member to present the user with the options that they have, and the other one to represent the option that they actually selected. So let's go to our controller and see what we need to do there to make this work. To render the form, I'm not going to need to do anything special whatsoever because we're just creating the view model and tossing it in. Here though, since my cheese now has a type property, I should go ahead and initialize that. And that should come from the type property in the add cheese view model, which again is going to be what the user has selected. Okay, there's going to be a little bit more work for us to do in the view itself. Let's go ahead and bounce over to the add razor template. So we already have two different form groups here representing the 2 different inputs we have. We need to go ahead and make another one. And in this case, I want a label. And I'm going to use my tag helpers. And I'm going to say that this is for the type property. And instead of an input here, I need to make a select. And I still use ASP4 and specify that this will be the select for the type property. And on my select, I also get to specify the options using the ASP items tag. Okay, and so here is where I need to specifically call out the name of the property that holds the options that the user will give me, or the user will have to choose from rather. And that's going to come from my model and the cheese types. Okay. And notice I didn't have to use the @razor syntax here, but I did have to specify that this came off the model. That's a little bit confusing over here. We didn't have to say model.type, but over here we do need to say model.cheesetypes. So just something to be aware of. Okay, so let's go ahead and start up our application and see how we did. Okay, so to do this test, we need to go to the add cheese form. When we do that, we see that we now have a third input that's a select input, and it has the 3 options that we added to our list of select list items that were all rendered appropriately. If you were to go to your browser tools and look at that select, you would then see within that each of the options with the values, the integer values that back those up for these enum types, just as we created them. So you see that those were used by ASP.NET to render that select list for us. And now here I need to go ahead and add an item. And cheddar's mostly more hard than soft, so we'll leave that as our choice. And then we'll add it. And we see that we did create the cheese. Now that would be nice if we can actually show a third column in our table here corresponding to that new field. So let's go ahead and add that to our index template. So here we want the table header to be type, and we're just going to say that this should be @cheese.type. Again, notice that we're getting those auto suggestions, and we're going to have some compile checking by Visual Studio because we're using a view model here in our template. And there we go. So we have a type now in our third column. So that's just a slightly more complex way of using view models to represent data that might be different in terms of how it's represented in the form versus how it will be received when the form is submitted. And so you'll have some more complex variations of this as you go along and as you make applications with more sophisticated and slightly more complicated use cases.